कार आज हमारे टेलीकॉन्फ्रेंस में आपके स्वागत है। वेलकम टू द फोर्थ टेलीकास्ट ऑफ द आरसीआई न्यू हाइट्स या नवशेखर चैनल। आज हमारे साथ है एक बहुत जाने माने my Hindi is terrible, do forgive me, a very well known person, Dr. Achal Bhagat. He has an MBBS, an MD, an MRCP in psychiatrist. He's a senior consultant, psychiatrist and psychotherapist at Apollo Hospital in Delhi. He's also the founder director of Sarthak, a voluntary organization working on the issues of rights of people with disability, with a special focus on people with mental illness. Dr. Bhagat is also an honorary consultant for the Quality of Life and Livelihoods program for people with disability at ADI, which used to be known formerly as the Spastic Society of Northern India, and he's on their governing board of the School of Rehabilitation Sciences. Apart from that, his real parichay in this sector is that he's a very strong activist, a lobbyist who believes very, very sincerely in the rights and rights-based issues and rights-based approach to the question and concern and issues of people with disabilities. So today we have Dr. Bhagat with us. He'll be talking about the history of disability and rehabilitation, basic concepts of disability and different categories of disabilities. And we will be having him with us. We are very honored and privileged to do that. He will be with us today, tomorrow and day after. And so I hand you over to Dr. Achal Bhagat. Dr. Bhagat, welcome on our program.
Thank you, Alokadi. I'm honored to be here, and मैं कोशिश करूँगा कि मैं दोनों भाषाओं में, एटलीस्ट दो भाषाओं में तो मैं बोल दूँ, हिंदी और अंग्रेज़ी. I'll try to be bilingual. मैं ये भी कोशिश करूँगा कि मैं जो अपनी बातचीत करूँ उसमें हम 1 घंटा इस्तेमाल करें और अगला 1 घंटा हम लोग फ़ोन पे क्वेश्चंस सुन सकें और आंसर कर सकें. मेरी प्रेजेंटेशन अंग्रेज़ी में है और वो काफ़ी कठिन अंग्रेज़ी में, तो मैं थोड़ा धीरे करके उससे बात करने की कोशिश करूँगा. That's easier. I know we are reaching out to a large part of the country, and it's very useful to try and be as flexible about language as possible. But if people find the language difficult, please do give a feedback on the phone. Tomorrow is another day, and one lives to survive. So let me start by talking about disability, history, and concepts. But before we do that, let's look at the present definition of disability. We all know that the UN Convention, the Rights of People with Disability, एक international law है जो कि हमारे सामने आया है, पिछले कुछ दिनों में ratify हुआ है, और वो law में disability की definition नहीं use की गई है, पर जो उसके preparatory papers हैं उसमें अगर देखा जाए तो disability की एक definition use की गई है. This is the definition of disability that has been used in the UN Convention, and that is persons with disabilities include those who have a long-term physical, mental, intellectual or sensory impairment, and this impairment, when it is in interaction with the various barriers, can hinder the full and effective participation of the person in society on an equal basis with the others. Now, this definition is a very clear definition. I think it talks about कि कुछ inherent impairments हो सकते हैं, कुछ acquired impairments हो सकती हैं. जो impairments हमारे शारीरिक, हमारे मानसिक, हमारे बौद्धिक और हमारे महसूस करने की शक्तियों में हो सकती हैं. और ये impairments जब किसी social barrier के साथ जुड़ती हैं तो हमारी functioning के ऊपर, हमारी participation के ऊपर effect करती हैं. इस definition तक पहुंचने में एक लंबा सफ़र रहा है और उस लंबे सफ़र को disability की history कहा जा सकता है. The journey to this definition is a very, very important journey, and that probably is the history of disability. And I am going to ask you difficult questions first before we move on. I'm going to talk about कि व्हाट इज हिस्ट्री, इतिहास होता क्या है? क्या डिसेबिलिटी के लिए एक अलग इतिहास है, या क्या जो हमारी रेस का, ह्यूमन रेस का इतिहास है वो डिसेबिलिटी का इतिहास भी है? और क्या इतिहास में और डिसेबिलिटी में जो जुड़ाव है उसमें हम किस चीज़ पे फोकस करें? मेरे हिसाब से इतिहास, मानवता का इतिहास और डिसेबिलिटी का इतिहास फर्क नहीं हो सकता. द हिस्ट्री ऑफ द ह्यूमन रेस कैन नॉट बी डिफरेंट फ्रॉम द हिस्ट्री ऑफ डिसेबिलिटी. मेरे हिसाब से हिस्ट्री को जब हम देखते हैं तो अपने पर्सनल पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू से देखते हैं. फॉर एग्जाम्पल, मैं if I talk about how I view history, or my history is cricket, for example, and my history is the past of cricket, wherein I know that India won the 1983 World Cup match. Right? I also know that India won the T20 World Cup. I also know that India has lost the series to Australia. These are my views of history. So the next time when I see the cricket match, I am viewing the cricket match with the knowledge of the history of cricket that I remember. Similarly, as a disabled person, one would have a knowledge of history, have an experience of history, have a memory of history, have a focus on history that is a very personal focus. So if I am not able to get onto the bus today, because the bus is full up with people, has a high board, does not stop for people with disability, then my experiences will be linked to the memory of all the history of exclusion, and I will feel angry about that history. So history cannot be seen in isolation. History is a large set of experiences that people have had in the way they have lived their life, and the way we approach it is the way we remember it, or the way we have experienced it. That's one very important point. तो मैं हिस्ट्री को, ह्यूमन हिस्ट्री को, आई एम नॉट केपेबल ऑफ डूइंग दिस, आई एम ओनली अ डॉक्टर, आई एम नॉट अ हिस्टोरियन, बट अगर ह्यूमन हिस्ट्री को डिसेबिलिटी के लेंस से देखा जाए और डिसेबिलिटी के पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू से देखा जाए, तो वो हिस्ट्री है हिस्ट्री ऑफ एक्सक्लूशन. फर्स्ट देयर इज अ हिस्ट्री ऑफ annihilation, disabled लोगों को मार दिया जाता था. Then there is a history of exclusion. Then there is a history of exploitation, and then there is a history of welfare, and then there is a history of rights. पर जो stereotypes हैं, जो कि difficulties हैं with the history of disability, वो रह गए हैं. और अगर हम अपने आसपास देखते हैं, तो अगर मैं नेक्स्ट स्लाइड पे जाऊं, तो अगर हम अपने आसपास देखते हैं तो ये पाएंगे कि हिस्ट्री में पास्ट, प्रेजेंट एंड फ्यूचर कोएग्जिस्ट. देयर इज नो सिंगुलर हिस्ट्री ऑफ द पास्ट. देयर इज हिस्ट्री इज नॉट ओनली अबाउट द पास्ट. फॉर एग्जांपल, टुडे व्हेन वी लुक एट क्रिकेट, 1983 is as much the history as last Wednesday, and last Wednesday would be as much the history as tomorrow. So the knowledge of tomorrow, that we have a match tomorrow, or and that we had a match yesterday, and the knowledge of T20 and the knowledge of the 83 World Cup, all are history that coexist. Similarly, the history of disability coexists. उसका जो past है, stereotypes हैं, जो कि हमारे programs में दिखते हैं, हमारे laws में दिखते हैं, हमारे violative circumstances में दिखते हैं, exploitative circumstances में दिखते हैं, they are coexisting around in us only. कुछ लोगों की एक्सप्लॉयटेशन ज़्यादा होती है, कुछ लोगों की एक्सक्लूजन ज़्यादा होती है, कुछ लोगों के एक्सपीरियंसेस ज़्यादा नेगेटिव होते हैं. Some people have lesser resources, lesser opportunities, and are excluded more than other people, and that might be the past for someone else, but is the present for someone else. So in the history of disability, we cannot जैसे दिल्ली में, if you look at Delhi, the history of Delhi, there are about 7 Delhis, we are told. But if you go around Delhi, you'll find all the 7 Delhis even exist today. In people's minds, in people's lives, in people's realities, all those 7 Delhis exist today. Similarly, for a person with disability, the past, present, and the future coexist. So when we talk about the UN Convention and its application, we're talking about a future for the person with disability, and we're talking about a future, but the aspiration lives today. When we're talking about, say, people with mental illness not being on the executive committee of in the Disability Commissioner's office, we're talking about an exclusion from the past that exists even today. We're talking about a pejorative past for some disabilities which has continued to exist today. So history cannot be divided into a linear way of looking at things. It's coexistence. So if you were to look at that point of view of history, then you will see that there are three things, three small ways of looking at disability. One, where disability was seen as the person. That's one history, where the person was forgotten and the disability was seen as the person. That's one part of the history. Then there's another part of the history where disability was seen as a social problem for which the society had to do some things. And then if you look at what's current knowledge of disability, people are not talking about disabilities, people are talking about abilities, functioning, the person and the rights of the person, and not focusing on the impairments, the limitations, the barriers. Those exist, but the knowledge of the rights overpowers the existence of the other things. So these are the three components of history. अब उसमें मैं ये नहीं कहूँगा कि हेलेन केलर ने इस सन में ये किया था और RCI इस सन में फॉर्म हुआ था और PWD Act 1995 में आया था. That is not the history. The knowledge of these three conceptual ways of looking at disabled people which coexist today is the history of disability, and that's what we are in a way trying to fight, and that's also what we are trying to learn from and grow and consolidate upon. So history has its benefits and its limitations. I am going to focus on my perception of the future in the visualization of the history. And what I'm going to focus on is what is it that the current concepts are that we're looking at. Alokati talked about my focus on the rights-based approach, or our focus on the rights-based approach, and how it's very important. Let's today, through this conversation, dissect what are the concepts that make a rights-based approach possible for an individual, for a community, for a program, and for the nation. Let's try and deconstruct that and understand that while we talk about the concepts of disability. So just to give a visual representation, to focus on the past of disability, just to clarify that one more time. If you were to visualize a very huge mountain, and a mountain on the cliff, there were resources, trees, which were available there. Now these resources are managed by a few people who unfortunately are not the large part of the society. They're not the base of the society, they're not the foundation of that society. They've grown to manage those resources, and they are or they've been born into those resources, and they are managing those resources. At the bottom is a heap of people who have been marginalized, excluded from these resources, and some people are brought into these resources by ladders thrown from the top of the cliff. Some people can manage, and these are the programs and schemes of the government. Some people are able to reach the resources, some people are not able to reach the resources. There's a lot of fight amongst the people to reach the resources. And then there is another level below this valley. There's another level where the person with disability is placed. So this person is invisibilized from the marginalized groups as well. Women are marginalized, Dalits are marginalized, a lot of other people are marginalized, and they do not have access to the resources. But the person with disability is even more marginalized and dually and triply and quadruply disbenefited and disempowered and invisibilized, because the way the person with disability has access to resources is only when somebody from who is in control of the resources flies down with a helicopter with a very, very special program and distributes things in this invisibilized areas. And our effort is to move away from this past. And this flight of the helicopter down to the invisibilized areas and down to the invisibilized masses of people with disability is what used to be called the welfare approach, where you had to wait for somebody to think that you are pitiful enough to be focused upon, that your plight is something that they take pity on, and then you are focused upon that. And जिसके मन में जो आ गया उसने कर दिया, आपकी ज़रूरतें किसी ने नहीं पूछी, आपकी आप क्या चाहते हो वो किसी ने नहीं पूछा, आपकी आवाज़ किसी ने नहीं सुनी, कोई आ गया किसी ने दे दिया तो दे दिया, नहीं दे दिया तो फिर 10 साल बाद मिलेंगे। धीरे धीरे क्या हुआ कि हेलीकॉप्टर की फ्लाइट्स बढ़ गई हैं, और लड़ाई के साथ हमने वी हैव बीन एबल टू अचीव more helicopter flights, and now there is a special CD as well. There is a ladder down the cliff which is called the disability programming, and that's a specific ladder that we've got, but we are way away from that ladder. Our voice is way away from that ladder. So moving from the welfare approach from these helicopter flights or these ladders, we have to do something bigger. Then we came to the concept of mainstreaming. Mainstreaming was that whatever ladders are available to other people are also available to people with disability. So instead of having one ladder from the cliff, we had 10 ladders from the cliff, one on education, one on health, one on other things, which was good, except that I am a person with disability. I'm at the fringe anyway. I'm invisibilized anyway. So how do I, through that mass of people, access that ladder? There's no way made for me to reach the ladder. Now, because of that, mainstreaming also has failed, and also these ladders are very few. There's a mass of people there. There are very few ladders. So if you have a Rozgar Yojana, and if you have one ladder, there are millions of people looking for that Rozgar Yojana. So the specific programming failed, and the mainstreaming also has failed because the ladders that were coming down were weak anyway. So, and that's why a new thought has come in, which is talking about non-discrimination as a right and inclusion as a right. And we'll talk about these rights as we go along. So let me move over to the future and the present as I see it. The way I see it is that the future is focus on the abilities of the person, listen to the person, and acknowledge that people with disability have a right to the resources. They do not need to wait for the helicopter flights. They need to determine the resources that are available for them. They need to have the knowledge of the resources that are available for them, and they need to decide how those resources are used for them, rather than, and have a greater say and be a greater determinant of their own futures than other people's futures. And they also need to not only determine their own futures, but they also need to be participating in the community to decide what is important for the community as well, because they form a large part. We form a large part of the community. So it is very important that we all are participating in this decision-making process about how resources are used for us. This is the rights-based approach to disability. And when you hear about it in this manner, would you prefer a helicopter flying down to you in a remote area to get you some food, or would you want to determine what crops are used in your area, what do you eat, how much is available to you, and how it's available to everyone and not just to you? Would you want to determine that? The choice is very clear, that we need to move away from the welfare approach to a rights-based approach. Of course, in the transition, what will happen? What will happen to this specific ladder that we have? Or of disability programming? What will happen to the mainstreaming efforts? What will happen to the Sarv Shiksha Abhiyan? What will happen to the Samarthya Home? Those are Samarthya Home is an example of disability specific programming, and Sarv Shiksha Abhiyan is mainstreaming into education. It's these are very important efforts. So do we ignore them, or do we use them in our fight for the rights of people with disability? I think we should use them in our fight for rights for people with disability. So the purpose of the present has to be this: to promote, protect, ensure the full an equal enjoyment of all human rights and fundamental freedoms by all persons with disability, and to promote respect for inherent dignity. Now, this is not my statement. This is what the UN Convention is saying. This is the purpose of the UN Convention of Rights of People with Disability. The right is to promote equal and full enjoyment, not a partial enjoyment. It's a full enjoyment of all rights, all human rights, and all rights, including respect for dignity. These are very, very important statements, that just because I'm getting something from you does not mean that I have to be treated in a manner which is shoddy, does not mean that I have to be exhibited before people, does not mean that my products you have to be patronizing about my abilities. It means that you have to respect my abilities, and if you and you have to assess me with similar ways, with similar objectives, if not the ways, to be able to ensure that I participate equally. You have to support me with similar ways and in similar proportions as you would any other person. So the organizations that I work with, we have a common vision. Both Adi and Sarthak are organizations that I work with very closely, and our vision is this, and this is derived from the UN Convention. So I'm sharing the vision so that, because it's a conceptual, a new concept that we've arrived at, because both the organizations have worked in the past as well, and both the organizations have moved on from there to arrive at this vision, and that's why I'm sharing this vision with people. So we're looking for a world in which people with disability are an integral part of the society, with equitable access to opportunities and services and resources, enabling them to participate fully in the community and live life to the fullest. It is a paraphrase of what the convention is saying. And it's very important that we align ourselves to the way the convention is talking about the new concepts of rights-based approaches to disability. Moving on, I'm just realizing, Alokali, that speaking for an hour is a very long time.
It's a long time, yes. But
so I'll take a sip of water and then continue.
So आप अभी सुन रहे थे डॉक्टर अचल भगत को about his concept of he has presented the history of disability in a very interesting way. Our course material, our papers tell you about the first school for the blind and the first school for the MR, and how this has grown over a period of time. And he has identified history in terms of annihilation, exclusion, exploitation, welfare and rights. And very simply, that really is a history not only of people with disabilities, but for all equity-seeking groups, for all disadvantaged groups, for all groups like women, children, Dalits, etc. So if you feel that you still want another presentation on how the history of disability is represented in your course material, we can still do that. You write and let me know, or phone and let me know, and we will do that again. So but the rights-based approach, as explained by Dr. Bhagat, is a very unique and interesting way, and I'll now put you back on to Dr. Bhagat to continue with about concepts in disability.
Right. So we are now going to focus on the concepts in disability. The first concept that is very important is respect for inherent dignity, individual autonomy, including freedom to make one's own choices, and independence of persons. It's a very important concept. As a society, as a culture in India, we are very respectful of each other, but we are also very closely knit with each other, which means that the group needs are more than the individual needs. But as the time has progressed, the needs of the family and to be able to express oneself within the family as an individual is also very important. So from a group-based identity, we have moved on as so for example, if you were to take the history of family in India, we were a joint family system, and then from the joint family system we became a nuclear family system, and if you were to now look at nuclear families, people are talking about what is it, how is my identity represented in this family. That's how families have moved in India. Now, if you were to look at a person with disability, how do they develop their identity? Uh, for example, if I get up in the morning, I do not say to myself that I'm Achal Bhagat, I'm a bit fat, I have a mustache, my hair fall on my face, I'm a psychiatrist. I do not say these things to myself. I know these things because I've had an opportunity to get these feedbacks from people, and I've experienced people identify me thus. So I have also developed a personal way of identifying myself. And most of these experiences, I've had experiences of violation as well, but my experiences of violation are very limited. Uh, my experiences of violation are limited to somebody parking their car in front of my car and I not being able to move my car. That's an experience of violation that I would have had. Or somebody not paying their tax and I paying my tax and I having to pay more tax than other people. That's an experience of violation that I would have had. But the experience of violation that a person with disability has is much more significant than the experience of violation that I have. So my experiences, the avenues, that identity that I have developed from my experiences is of valuing myself as a person and not focusing on my limitations. Whereas when one hears and talks to people with disability, the experiences that they say that they have had is that they're reminded of their disability in most of their experiences, wittingly or unwittingly. So if, for example, in this room, a person with disability were to come, just the process of getting into the room, and this is an accessible room, would mean that this table would have to be moved. You can't see the edge of the table, but it's extending out right up to the wall. This table would have to be moved. The wheelchair would take some time to get here. That whole experience would remind them of the fact that there's a limitation, there is a disability. Now, what the convention is asking us to do is to follow a principle, the rights would ask us to do, that we design this room in a manner so that label of the limitation is not highlighted. It is designed in a manner that anybody, whether on the wheelchair or not on the wheelchair, has similar accessibility in this room. And that is the principle of respect for dignity, that you have multiple experiences and all those experiences value you as a person and do not focus on the limitation that you might be facing or the world might be making you face. And that's dignity. Now, what about individuality and autonomy? Unfortunately, most services for people with disability are designed in a group kind of a manner. Disabled are seen as one group and one kind of services are designed, and because of that one kind of design of services, most people are not able to personalize that service. Now, the difficulty with that, of course, is that you get identified as a group rather than as an individual. And your own individuality does not get too many chances to be expressed. And that is a limitation. That is a huge limitation, because most people, whether they are disabled or not disabled, most people want to express their individuality. Most of us carry our individuality with us. And for example, when I speak, I move my hands. When Alokadi speaks, she does not move her hands so much. These are individual. We might think similarly, we might do a lot of similar things, but we're not same people, because we have different ways of expressing ourselves, and that opportunity becomes limited by the society when you are. So the principle of individual autonomy, the principle of dignity would mean that there are multiple avenues available for anybody and everybody, and there is universal design to be able to achieve those multiple avenues. Then there is a question of non-discrimination. Now, mostly discrimination is about how resources and opportunities are distributed and structured. So people who do not have a voice for themselves are discriminated against. We've heard of vote banks, haven't we? The moment you're a vote bank, the discrimination that you face becomes slightly lower. We've also heard of reservations and affirmative action. The moment people recognize that you've been discriminated against for a long time, there is affirmative action to look after you so that you get your rights fulfilled. But when you're a person with disability, unfortunately, you're still continuously discriminated against, because most people who are decision makers have not experienced disability themselves, or have not heard from people who have faced disability or have experienced disability. Now, so the discrimination starts from non-participation. If you're going to end discrimination, we have to increase participation. And then we have to see how do we put resources in place so that discrimination is addressed. For example, if I were not able to travel to RCI on my own, I haven't come by a bus, but for example, if I were to come here by a bus, and there's a huge bus strike happening in Delhi today, and everybody is outside on the street, and if I was not able to board that bus, if RCI were to send me a limousine to pick me up, that's unlikely, but if RCI were to send me a limousine to pick me up, that will be a foolish use of the resources, because on one person's travel to RCI, however important it might be, so much money would have been spent. But if RCI, to enable participation of people in this program, were to start a modification of auto rickshaws in Delhi as a process, or National Trust or somebody were to say, from here on, all auto rickshaws will carry a ramp and their seats will be placed slightly differently so that anybody can use an auto rickshaw, that would be a better use of resources. So it's how you use the resource that leads to discrimination or non-discrimination. Unfortunately, most of our processes use either allocate resources in a fixed manner. So a Samarthya scheme or any scheme would be fixed. You can pay this much, this much, this much to these many people, and this is how it will work. Because of replication, it's very easy to have a fixed scheme, or there will be no allocation. There will be no allocation for majority of the people. Most of the resources will be spent on very, very few people. And that's what we need to change if we have to move towards non-discrimination. Then we are talking about full and effective participation and inclusion in society. What does participation mean to you? Participation is a very interesting jargon. I love that jargon. But what is participation?
And the difference between full and effective?
Full and effective. I was coming to that. I mean, you could have tokenistic participation, couldn't you? Which means that you have a convention or a conference where you invite 3 people who are disabled and say there's participation, and there is this voice of people with disability. And this is my fight with most people who use participatory processes. For example, there are consultative processes for the amendment process. And when one asks the question, what is the participation of people with disability in this consultation processes? Especially when most of the consultations are web-based, most of the consultations are not available in Hindi, not available in alternative forms of communication. Most of the consultations are held in very short periods of time and do not involve people with disability to the extent that they should be involved. So what is it? Is that full and effective participation? The reality is that it is not. The reality is that it's a long battle. Participation means that not only do you participate, but you also participate in the process of decision making. That you have the information to participate in the process of decision making, that your skills are strengthened to be able to take decisions, that your skills are strengthened to be able to communicate what you want to say. And you're given tools and accessories and adaptations and accommodations.
Reasonable accommodations.
Reasonable accommodations to be able to communicate in the way that you want to communicate. And when you do communicate, you're not told, we'll think about it later.
Can we have the graphic? It's a very good graphic and it has a lot of information on it. Can we show that, Kabir? A little bit more of the graphic. Jitne sare points hai aapke.
Right. So if we can keep on going back to the graphic from time to time, with each new point that I'm starting, if we can keep on going back to the graphic. So we've just talked about full and effective participation, and then we are going to talk about inclusion. I'm going to talk about inclusion slightly later because it's a concept that needs more understanding. Uh, then let me talk about uh, accessibility. Most people understand, but accessibility most people understand as accessibility in terms of mobility, accessibility in terms of uh, the way the buildings are structured. Nobody talks about accessibility in terms of the way the processes are structured. And how do we change the way the processes are structured, or the way the processes are thought of, that they are more accessible. For example, people with mental illness do not need an accommodation on by in the way of a ramp, but they do need an accommodation in the way the information is provided to them. So, for example, if I were a person with mental illness, I would need the information to be provided to me not in form of this graphic, but with one point at a time, and with one point at a time, with shorter sentences, with somebody also reading out the sentences to me. I would want the cubicle that is providing the information to have a slightly higher partition, so that other information sources, other stimuli do not disturb me. Now, unfortunately, accessibility is understood only in form of ramps. For example, if we talk about, say, the Person with Disability Act says that 25% or some percentage of land, government land allotments will be used for persons with disability. Housing allotments will be used for persons with disability. There's a clause which Roma found out for me, saying that there is a clause which says, well, some percentage of, I'm not sure, 25%, 25% sounds too much, but some percentage of land allotments will be used for people with disability. Now, for that knowledge to be accessible to the person on the ground, I did not know it till somebody dug it out for me.
Actually, I'm not aware of it either. I think there is a allotment of land on a preferential basis, but there is no percentage
Right.
allotment.
So even if there was preferential basis land allotment that was available to me as a person with disability, if I did not know about it, then it's inaccessible to me.
Right.
So even if the DDA office became an office with the ramps, it's still not an office with the ramps. But even if it becomes an office with a ramp, if I did not know about my rights in that office, then how would I access that information? If I do not have information, then I do not access the service. If I do not have the service, then how do I access accountability measures? So I have to have these things accessible to me in a manner that I can use the information that I need. The next 2 points are very, very important. That's equality between men and women, and a focus and knowledge of evolving capacities of children. These are very important aspects which we need to focus on. Women, unfortunately, have faced centuries of discrimination. Women who are people with disability have even faced further stigma and further discrimination. And that means that the programming that looks at people with disability, the way we look at people with disability, has to make an even harder effort to stop the discrimination of women who are disabled. Most programs, if you look at the numbers still, are still focusing more on men and less on women. And the type of programming that is offered to men is different than the type of programming that is offered to women. So we need to see how do we change that. Similarly, most people with disability, even if they are adults, I've just come from a meeting of parents, and most of the people there were parents of people who are about 30 to 40 years of age. But most of them were calling the people with disability children. Now, what people have forgotten in this whole thing is that, yes, a person with disability may have been a child at some point of time, and they may have been a student or our colleague or a member of our program at some point of time. But now, today, they are an adult, and a lot of their capacities are different and have evolved differently. Some of them have changed, some of their needs have changed, some of their views have changed, some of their feelings have changed. So how do we respect this change? How do we become aware of this change? Because we would be aware of such changes in people who are not disabled. For example, we would not talk to, for example, Aloka Di, I think you're older than me, Aloka Di.
Lots.
So when you would talk to me, you would not talk to me as if I was, say, 16 years of age or 15 years of age. You would talk to me, even if I was younger, you would not treat me as Chota Bhai, you would treat me as an equal. So if we will not do it with people who are not disabled, what is it that makes us do it with people who are disabled? What is this whole parental thing that happens to us when we're talking about people with disability, and why do we get into these patriarchal roles? And we have to question ourselves about कि हम suddenly बच्चे को जब बड़ा भी हो गया तो बच्चे की तरह क्यों समझ रहे हैं हम उसको एक व्यक्ति की तरह क्यों नहीं सोच रहे हैं क्योंकि वो डिफरेंट है इस वक्त जब वो बच्चा था वो डिफरेंट था अब जो बड़ा हो गया वो डिफरेंट है और इसके ऊपर फोकस करना बहुत ज़रूरी है हमारा So people with disability are people first. That's if you want to go back with a lesson from our conversation, people with disability are people first. Exclusion of people, any kind of people, marginalization of any kind of people, invisibilization of any kind of people, किसी को अलग थलग कर दिया है तो वो इंडिविजुअल तो कीमत चुकाता ही है बट सोसाइटी भी कीमत चुकाती है क्योंकि एक ऐसी सोसाइटी जो खाली कुछ लोगों के लिए बनी है वो कभी भी पूर्ण सोसाइटी नहीं हो सकती है. So exclusion has both an individual cost and a societal cost, and we need to remember that. Before I close, I think just a comment on inclusion, क्योंकि हम exclusion की बात कर रहे हैं तो inclusion की बात करनी भी बहुत ज़रूरी है. Inclusion के different stages होते हैं और जैसे historically हम different stages से गुजर चुके हैं पर एक टाइम पर सब stages present हैं उसी तरह से इंक्लूजन के भी डिफरेंट स्टेजेस एक ही प्रोग्राम में एक ही जगह एक ही कंट्री में साथ साथ प्रेजेंट होते हैं. इंक्लूजन का जो एक एंड है वो एक्सक्लूजन है जहाँ पे जो डिसेबल्ड आदमी है उसके ऊपर फोकस ही नहीं हो रहा है. द पर्सन विद डिसेबिलिटी इज नॉट बीन फोकस्ड अपॉन एट ऑल एंड द मेन स्ट्रीम इज फोकसिंग अपॉन इटसेल्फ. सो द डिसेबल्ड पर्सन इज सेपरेट फ्रॉम द प्रोसेसेस ऑफ द सोसाइटी. Then there is the whole process of targeting people with disability through some specific measures, specific programs, specific rules, specific laws, and targeting can be both negative and positive. So in our country we see a lot of targeting happening even today. Some of it is positive, some of it is negative. For example, I'll give you a story which I read in the newspaper today. It seems people with disability have formed a political party. I'll not name the party because that will be preferentially taking sides. They formed a political party. And yesterday, they had two groups in that society. And both the groups fought with each other in a dharna that they had organized. So I hear from the news story. I don't know because I was not there myself. Now, the police arrested everybody there because the people were fighting with each other. Any other political party, unfortunately or fortunately, if the two groups had fought with each other, would not have, people would not have been arrested for fighting with each other because it's usual, you see it every day, nor would it have become news. Because people with disability get targeted upon, people have not reported the positive fact that people with disability have formed a political party and they are fighting for their rights. People are focusing on people with disability are fighting with each other. Tell me one person who's not fighting with another person in this country, especially on political issues. We have all got our politics and all have different ways of expressing our politics, and expression of political differences is a part of democracy. But when two groups who are disabled fight with each other, somehow we become moralistic and say, oh, people with disability are fighting with each other, and it becomes news because that's targeting of people with disability. And there are many other ways of targeting that I could talk about, but in programming also there is targeting. But then there is the next step in programming, inclusion. That's called, in the programming language, it's called component plans. So if there is an education department, they have a component plan focusing on disabled people within that education department. And so the disabled person is focused upon in a particular plan or in a particular program. they're not treated as anybody else. And then there is the stage of being included, where the program has changed its shape so that all people, including people with disability, have equitable access to the resources of the program. We are nowhere near the fourth stage of inclusion. That's the programs have changed their shape to include people with disability. I think we are somewhere between excluded, targeted, and focused upon. But we need to get to being included, and that's the concept that we need to stay with. So my request is that whether you're a student, whether you're a practitioner, whether you're an activist, all of us need to look at 4 dimensions to review our work: participation, inclusion, whether the people are treated with dignity in our programs, and whether they have a control to the extent of making decisions for that program, not control to the extent of being present once in a while in a governing board meeting. Whether the language of the program, whether the structure of the program, whether whatever we do intends to transfer the ownership to the person with disability. Because there is a need for transfer of that ownership, because that transfer of ownership, unless that exists, or the possibility of that exists, there is all the opportunity of that exists. The possibility of that exists right now because of the convention. The opportunity for that has to exist, and the method for that has to exist. And probably we'll carry on with the conversation tomorrow, and explore this further. I think we are reaching an end of the hour, or I could go further if we had more time.
I would like to take this a little further, Dr. Bhagat. We were wanting to discuss the different categories of disabilities. Are you going to discuss that today or tomorrow?
No, that I will come back on tomorrow. And again, I'm going to come back from the convention's point of view, not the syllabus's point of view. The reason I'm going to come back on it from the convention's point of view is because the various categories of disability are actually categories of impairment. They're not categories of disability. They've been confused as categories of disability, because if you add to that the social barriers, then the impact of that disability can be very similar. And if we look at impacts of disability and impact of exclusion, then what we'll find is that most impairments can be excluded in a very similar manner. So we will talk about the categories of impairment and the exclusion that goes along with them and the barriers that go along with them.
Okay, so we'll have to change our style of presentation a bit, because what we have for our audience are students who have to study what is visual impairment, what is low vision, what is hearing impairment, and what is leprosy cured, and mental retardation, and mental illness, and autism, etc. So Dr. Bhagat has a different way of presenting, which will be slightly different from what you have been prescribed in your syllabus. So we will listen to Dr. Bhagat's presentation and we will learn from it, but we will also add to it in terms of what is in your prescribed syllabus. So at this point in time, maybe we will take calls from before we take calls, no, we are open to calls. Please phone in. I was actually going to mention that the definition that Dr. Bhagat gave of disability is part of, as he rightly said, I just want to reiterate that, is the definition that he has given.
I can go back to it.
Yes, is part of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Now that is something very, very recent. You may or may not have been informed about it in your course curriculum as yet. India signed the convention on the 31st of March and was ratified, got the President's assent on the 1st of October. India is one of the first 7 countries in the world to ratify the convention. Among the larger, the more developing countries, it is the first. It is in the South Asia region, it is the first country to ratify. Now it has immense ramifications and meaning for the disability sector, and we will have a whole session on the UN Convention at a later stage when we will call in people like Dr. Amita Dhanda, Anuradha Mohit, etc., and the Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment to discuss the UN Convention. So, see, Dr. Bhagat ne definition diya that is purely the latest that we have taken from the convention. Now, the convention itself does not have a definition per se, as he says, but in the purpose, for whom is this convention meant, usme ye likha hai ki it is for these kind of people. Now, when we were discussing the convention, negotiating the text, it was left to each country to decide its own definitions. That is why definition has not been given of disability or of person with disability. So, हमारे देश में लागू है अब इस वक्त Persons with Disabilities Act 1996 में जो अलग अलग 7 categories है, उसमें है orthopedic and locomotor disability including cerebral palsy, फिर है visual impairment along with low vision, then है hearing impairment, then there is leprosy cured, then there is mental retardation, then there is mental illness. I have left out something. What have I left out? Anyway, altogether 7 disabilities, and then for National Trust Act में there is the autism, cerebral palsy separate category, mental retardation and multiple disabilities. So ये सब मिला के हमारे देश में mandatory statutorily recognized disabilities are these disabilities, and इसके बारे में definitions as per the act and as per the policies in India, we address these disabilities. So iske baare mein, what are the definitions, what are the schemes वगैरह of the government, what the government is doing for these people with disabilities, iske baare mein, and how the history of disability in the world and in India has evolved, and as per your syllabus जो लिखा है उसके बारे में हम दूसरे अलग चर्चा करेंगे. We will invite another expert for that. Dr. Bhagat is giving the very latest and the most updated information, which is a rights based. जैसे paradigm shift उन्होंने कहा कि पहले welfare based था, charity based था, थोड़ा that has moved into development model, a social model, and it's very interesting that we talk about the difference between a medical model and a social model, and a doctor talks more about the social model than the medical model, which is very heartening, and that is why we have invited him today. So ये जो trends हुआ, ये जो shifts हुआ in the disability sector, this is going to be reflected in the revision of the curriculum that we are doing now. In fact, आज कल और आज 2 दिन का मीटिंग हो रही है Rehabilitation Council of India में कि disability diploma in special education in hearing impairment, visual impairment and mental retardation अभी rewriting हो रहा. ऊपर में conference room में 3 groups बैठे हैं और वो harmonize करने की कोशिश कर रहे हैं कि सब में equal number of papers हो, equal number of marks हो, core papers एकदम same हो, ताकि हम credit system launch कर सकते हैं 2008 में. तो तीनों courses को अभी harmonize हो रहा है, negotiations चल रहा है. तो आपके syllabus में अभी in the new revised curriculum will include all of the things that Dr. Bhagat has been talking about now in the new curriculum. अभी जो आपके syllabus है वो थोड़ा सा फ़र्क है और उसके लिए हम दूसरे एक्सपर्ट्स को बुलाएंगे ताकि आपके सिलेबस में जो कवर हो रहा इस वक्त वो उनको एड्रेस कर सके. मगर आपने जो राइट्स बेस्ड अप्रोच कहा तो आप ये बताएं कि राइट्स बेस्ड अप्रोच, हाउ डिड दिस मूवमेंट टेक प्लेस फ्रॉम वेलफेयर टू डेवलपमेंट, फ्रॉम चैरिटी टू पार्टिसिपेशन? It's a movement that has taken place. It didn't just happen. It was campaigned for, etc. It's a long movement. How did that happen, Dr. Bhagat?
I again don't want to go into events. I want to go into processes. कि मेरा मानना ये है कि अधिकार किसी की जब अवहेलना होती है तो उसकी जानकारी कोई बाहर से आके नहीं देता कि मेरे अधिकारों की अवहेलना हो रही है। अगर मेरे अधिकारों की अवहेलना हो रही है तो मुझे महसूस हो जाता है कि मेरे अधिकारों की अवहेलना हो रही है, क्योंकि जो ह्यूमन राइट्स होते हैं, मानवीय अधिकार होते हैं, मानव अधिकार होते हैं, वो इसलिए होते हैं क्योंकि मैं एक ह्यूमन बीइंग हूँ, मैं एक मनुष्य हूँ, इसलिए मेरे अधिकार हैं। तो जब उनकी अवहेलना होती है मुझे मालूम होता है कि मेरी अधिकारों की अवहेलना हो रही है। और वो जो ये जो नॉलेज है, ये जो जानकारी है कि मेरे अधिकारों की अवहेलना होती है, ये एक गुस्से में परिवर्तित हो जाती है। और जब वो गुस्सा जाहिर होना शुरू होता है शब्दों में, एडवोकेसी के और बाकी मीन्स में, तो वो एक लार्ज मूवमेंट बन जाता है। और जब छोटी छोटी मूवमेंट्स इकट्ठे हो जाती हैं और सब कहते हैं अच्छा हमारे भी अधिकारों की अवहेलना हुई, अच्छा हमारे भी अधिकारों की अवहेलना हुई, सबके अधिकारों की अवहेलना हुई, तो बदलना चाहिए कुछ, हमारे को अपने अधिकारों की मांग रखनी चाहिए। और वो जो मांग इकट्ठे हुई और विश्व भर में देखी गई, तो सब लोगों ने देखा कि ह्यूमन राइट्स के कुछ इंस्ट्रूमेंट्स होने के बावजूद, ह्यूमन राइट्स पे लॉ पहले भी था, तो देखा गया कि डिसेबल्ड लोगों के राइट्स उन ह्यूमन राइट्स के लॉज होने के बावजूद भी उनकी अवहेलना हो रही है, उनकी बात नहीं सुनी जा रही है। तो स्पेसिफिकली फोकस करके ये कोई नए अधिकार नहीं मिले हैं इस कन्वेंशन से। हमारे जो अधिकार हैं वो वही रहे हैं जो कि कोई भी मानवीय अधिकार होते हैं, पर हाँ तरीके उन अधिकारों को कैसे पाया जाए वो डिसेबिलिटी कन्वेंशन ने ज़्यादा आउटलाइन कर दिए हैं कि जो डिसेबल्ड लोगों के अधिकार हैं उनको किस तरह से इम्प्लीमेंट किया जाए। और राइट्स के इम्प्लीमेंटेशन में तीन चीज़ें होती हैं कि अगर मेरा अधिकार है, फॉर एग्जांपल मेरा अधिकार है कि मैं पानी पीऊँ, तो अलोकादीन मेरे अधिकार को तीन तरह से मान्यता दे सकती है। पहले कि वो जब मैं कहूँ कि मुझे पानी पीना है, या जब मैं नहीं कहूँ कि मुझे पानी पीना है, उनकी जानकारी में हो कि ये मेरा अधिकार है कि मैं कभी भी पानी पी सकता हूँ। तो वो एक रूल नहीं बनाए कि मैं इस रूम में बैठ के पानी नहीं पी सकता हूँ, इस रूम में बैठ के मैं पानी पी सकता हूँ। उन्होंने एक दूसरा तो वो एक्नॉलेज करें कि मेरा राइट है ये, ठीक है। दूसरा वो एक्नॉलेज करें और मेरे को मदद करें पानी पिलवाने में। तो मैं उनसे जब पूछूं कि पानी कहाँ मिल सकता है तो वो मुझे बताएं कि पानी कहाँ मिलता है। तीसरा जो उन्होंने मेरे साथ किया कि मेरे बिना मांगे ही पानी का ग्लास यहाँ पे आ गया, क्योंकि मेरा अधिकार है कि मैं पानी पी सकूं। तो तीन लेवल्स होते हैं कि मानवीय अधिकारों, मानव अधिकारों की एक्नॉलेजमेंट हर कोई करता है। उसमें लिंक भी कर देते हैं कुछ लोग कि आपको हाँ यहाँ से रिसोर्स मिल सकता है। फुलफिलमेंट बहुत कम लोग करते हैं कि जो प्रोविजंस होते हैं कि जिससे मानवीय अधिकार पूरे हो सके, या जो चीज़ें मानवीय अधिकारों को तोड़ रही हैं, जो उनके वायलेशन कर रही हैं, उनको रोका जाए, वो फुलफिलमेंट बहुत कम होती है। जो हमारी लड़ाई रही है, मूवमेंट जो आप कह रहे हैं, उसमें भी हम जो अचीव कर पाए हैं इस मूवमेंट से एक्नॉलेजमेंट तक और शायद लिंक टू रिसोर्सेज तक कर पाए हैं। फुलफिलमेंट ऑफ राइट्स बहुत कम केसेस में हुआ है। और अब लड़ाई जो आगे है, जो आपका सिलेबस बदले ना बदले, जो आपने जुड़ना है उस लड़ाई में कि फुलफिलमेंट की तरफ कैसे चले।
मेरा ये भी कहना है कि इस लड़ाई में डिसेबल्ड लोग खुद अपने लड़ाई में शामिल हुए, शामिल नहीं, इन्होंने शुरू किया कि ये जो आंदोलन, ये जो कैंपेन, ये जो मूवमेंट है, इट्स बिन स्पीयरहेडेड बाय पीपल विद डिसेबिलिटीज देमसेल्व्स एंड बाय देयर फैमिली मेंबर्स। सो इस पॉइंट में हम छोटी से एक ब्रेक लेंगे और ब्रेक के बाद हम वापस आएंगे।